Hey everyone, thanks so much for tuning in to the Ideation Podcast. I'm so excited to have Andrew Means here. He's been a friend for over a decade now. And let me just give you a brief intro. And the way that we're going to spend our time today on this particular webinar is to have Andrew present for a few minutes, and then we're going to take questions from those who are tuning in live to this special webinar we're hosting today. Andrew Means is a serial social entrepreneur leading organizations that use data and technology to create impact. He is currently Senior Director of Global Impact Data Strategy for Salesforce.org. He is also co-founder of social sector data infrastructure firm BrightHive and founder of a professional development organization called Data Analysts for Social Good. He has previously held leadership positions at Uptake.org, the University of Chicago Center for Data Science and Public Policy, and the YMCA of Metropolitan Chicago. He holds a Master in Public Policy from the Harris School at the University of Chicago. Andrew is a member of the Board of Directors of Ingenuity Inc, VolunteerMatch, the Wabash Lights, and the Chairman of the Board at 10K Windows. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. I have a ton of questions for you, but before we jump into that and even hear from our participants, I'd love for you to spend a few minutes talking about data and framing that for us as we enter our time together.
Absolutely, Charles. Thank you so much for having me. This is, a topic that is near and dear to my heart. This idea of data and social impact and strategy. And bringing these worlds together. As Charles mentioned, I work at Salesforce.org, helping our 55,000 organizations that use our software for social impact and figure out how to do that more effectively. And I have started BrightHive, which helps organizations share information, and I love helping people learn about this topic. And so I started an organization called Data Analysts for Social Good, and we host things like the Good Tech Fest and other stuff to help people figure out how they can use data and technology for impact. So over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to just talk about what is impact, what's data got to do with impact, how we embed impact into our strategy, and then we'll have a longer conversation because this is a topic that we can take in 10,000 different directions, and everyone seems to come to a data conversation with their particular data question, and so we'll be sure to address some of those. But the first thing I want to talk about is what is impact, because impact's a word that I think we oftentimes use especially in the social sector, but we aren't really clear on what we mean by it. What does impact mean? Now, I often like to think of the analogy that I'm a coach, that I'm helping people train for a race. Now, there's a few different kinds of questions I'm going to want to ask to know if I'm an impactful coach, if I'm a successful coach. The first is, how many people ran the race, right? Was I a good coach in getting people to come to me to learn how to run faster, to run further, and to be a successful runner? How many people was I able to attract? How many people ran the race? Second thing I'm going to be looking at is how many people finished the race. If I'm a coach, my goal is to help people train to cross the finish line. And did they run it, further or faster than they did before? So I'm going to be interested. How many people did I train were able to finish the race? But if I'm actually concerned about my impact, my causal impact to these runners, I'm going to say how many people finished the race that wouldn't have otherwise? How many people ran faster than if they did had they not used my training program? That's going to tell you a little bit more about my impact. When we're thinking about impact, we can't just observe how many people crossed the finish line. We have to also ask ourselves, how many people crossed the finish line that wouldn't have otherwise? Getting to that kind of idea is super important when it comes to impact, because we have to realize, if going to the nonprofit examples, if I'm helping kids graduate from high school, I can't just look at how many of the students in my program graduated from high school. That's not actually my impact. My impact is how many of them graduated from high school that wouldn't have otherwise. Now, this is one of the challenging things about impact, is that we're essentially trying to answer a question that's unknowable. We often talk about impact measurement, and I think that's a little bit oxymoronic, because you can't actually measure your impact. You can only estimate it. You can only try to get close to what your impact might have been. Because really what we're trying to say is, imagine there are two worlds, one where your organization exists and one where it doesn't. Your impact is going to be the difference between those two worlds. It's going to be positive, it's going to be negative, it's going to be intended, it's going to be unintended. Oftentimes when we talk about impact, we're just talking about intended positive impacts. We aren't talking about like unintended negative impacts or unintended positive impacts. There's any number of ways in which our organizations might create change in the world. And so becoming concerned with like this idea of like, what's the difference between the world where I exist and the world where I don't is really helping frame up that impact kind of question. And I believe that every organization, every person, every group has an impact. And the question that, I like to help organizations think about is like, what's the impact that they're having? And again, this doesn't matter. Like business has impact, like nonprofits have impact, philanthropy, schools, groups of friends trying to do good in the world. All of them like create some level of change in the world. And the question that we want to become obsessed about is like, what is that change? And how do we know that change is occurring? So what's data have to do with kind of this impact question? I think there's two things that I think about when it comes to impact where data can be helpful. The first is data can help us prove the impact that we're having. It helps us know what's working, what's not, where, and why. And then for those of you that are listening today or might join us later on, if you're working inside the social sector, I'm sure that you're seeing many, many more organizations saying, we want more evidence and proof and data that what you're doing is effective, that you're having an impact. So data helps us prove, like say, like, look, we ran this program, like we ran this intervention. Here's the proof that we were impactful. But data also helps us improve our work. And this is actually where I spend a lot of my time, is helping organizations continuously learn from information from data so they can get better and better and better over time. That they're not just kind of saying, this is what we were able to accomplish, but they're able to say, this is what we were able to accomplish, and it'll be a little bit better next time, and a little bit better after that. Helps us learn and improve our work. Now, when we're zooming out, just think about data, there's any number of kinds of questions that data can help us answer. And these are just a few examples of the types of questions that data can help with. Like one is optimization questions, right? Like a lot of times we're trying to figure out, I have some scarce set of resources and I want some sort of outcome or change in the world. How might I apply my scarce set of resources to accomplish that change? And so there's kind of all these kind of optimization questions. Sometimes we're just looking for patterns. We're looking for data and data science to help illuminate patterns for us. We're able to say, I have all of this data about people or texts from Twitter or something, and I want to group them into different categories. Help me do that. And data science and data helps us do that. And it also helps us predict things. It helps us say, I don't quite, if I want to, try to better understand what the weather is going to be like this afternoon, how might, if I want to bring an umbrella today or not, how, what's the chance of rain? And so it helps us kind of answer these prediction type questions. And so data is good at some things and it's not good at others. And learning kind of like what kinds of questions data is good at answering and what kind of questions data isn't meant to answer is an important part of becoming a more sophisticated kind of data organization. But when it comes to data, or when it comes to impact, data is the evidence that you are having an impact, right? Like data is the evidence. I think a lot of organizations resort to stories and storytelling and other things like that. And those are important, and stories are so vital for communicating information and for telling something about impact. But if I want like really good evidence that your organization is having an impact, that your company is having an impact, that you're creating some kind of change in the world, data is what's going to help us do that. It's going to be the evidence for that. So I want to talk just for another couple minutes here, and then we'll open up for questions on embedding impact into your strategy. And I think this is going to be true and applicable, again, whether you're a nonprofit, a company, social enterprise, whatever. And the first point I want to make here is that social value is still value. I think this is really important for those of us that are working kind of often at this intersection of business and impact. We have to recognize that it's not just about making money and giving it away, or it's not just about like covering up for the ills of an organization. Like actually, the social value that we're creating is extremely valuable. If you're helping people sign up for public benefits, there's a tremendous value that you're helping generate and create. And we're seeing more and more innovative models that are connecting kind of financial value to social value. We're seeing this increasingly in the private sector. Just this year, within the last 12 months, we've had the Business Roundtable say that we need to look beyond just shareholder value to kind of the increasingly that all stakeholders and whether businesses is benefiting them. We have firms like BlackRock saying that they're taking in social impacts into their valuations of companies and in their investment strategies, as they see that companies that are more socially impactful are actually performing better financially long term. And we're seeing investment firms by impact ratings agencies and impact investment firms, trying to understand this intersection between social value and financial value. And so I think, no matter where you are, think about the value that your organization is creating. But when you're thinking about strategy, I think there's kind of three buckets of things. And I'm borrowing this from the IMP project, or this impact management project framework. And I think it's a great one. They really think about, there's kind of three buckets of activities that organizations engage in along a continuum of impact. And the first is simply just to act to avoid harm, right? Like if there are things that your organization is doing that's harmful to a community or to the environment, are there actions that you can take to actively act to avoid that harm? The second is to benefit communities, right? And this is the bucket of things that are just kind of good for the communities in which you live and work. This could be supporting local nonprofits. This could be helping clean up streets. It could be, planting trees in a community. These are things that just like benefit the quality of life for the communities in which you live and work. And then the third, kind of like furthest along on the impact continuum, is this idea of contributing to solutions. This is where you're actively working to solve a particular problem in a specific place. And where you're actively saying, how can we as a business, or how can we as an organization actively solve a problem out there in the world? And so I think there's plenty of ways in which, no matter what kind of organization you have, you can integrate impact into your strategy along this continuum. So I just want to pause here or stop here and really kind of open up for conversation. There's lots of different directions that we can take this, as I mentioned, but we'll just kind of stop here and see what questions Charles might have, or any of the rest of you.
This is great, Andrew. Thanks so much for sharing that. I guess, when I think about data, one of the questions that I hear often is like knowing like which types of data to actually track. I mean, we're going to see some of the complexities of this because, I mean, obviously people want some level of privacy.
Mm-hmm.
And, as an organization, when I see a lot of organizations collecting data that they never use. So when you think about that, like, how do you advise groups to think about, okay, frame a little bit of that thinking for us? I think you kind of refer to it in your talk, but how does that practically work? If I'm an organization trying to use data as an evidence for impact, what types of questions should I be asking on what to gather?
So the first thing, Charles, and you brought this up in your question, is if you're not using the data, don't collect it, right?
Mm.
Data collection, especially around oftentimes impact things, is costly. It's like timely. It takes time, it takes resources, it takes something to go and collect that information. So if you're not getting any benefit from it, if you're not actually using any of that information, I always recommend that organizations stop collecting that kinds of information. And then the second thing I'd say is, for information that you're already collecting or that you're considering collecting, I love this kind of line of like, don't collect what you can't protect.
Mm.
Really thinking through the security implications and how are you going to ensure that this data is going to be used appropriately and all of it, and for the intended purposes. So those are just kind of like two basic ground rules. But if you're thinking about what it looks like to collect data around your impact, the first thing that I oftentimes work with organizations on is just what's the impact that you're trying to have, and getting really concrete and defining that. I think for many organizations, we have very, shall I say, aspirational mission statements and goals and objectives.
Right.
When I arrived at an organization early in my career, they wanted to like build the character of the children that they worked with, of the kids that they worked with, youth they worked with. Now, and they're like, and we'd like you to measure that. Like, that was my job. and that's like, I was like, I can't tell you that like Sally has 3 units of character and like Johnny has 5 units of character. Like, there's no such thing as like unit of character. And so what I did is I spent the first couple of months meeting with like program leaders and people across our organization to say, like, how do you know when somebody has more character than somebody else? Like, what is that? Like, when you actively think about this and you're looking at the kids that you're working with, like, what are you looking for? And what emerged were things like they ask for help when they need it. They, they when they're not going to be able to attend something, they let us know. Like, there's all these kinds of like behaviors that they were actually looking for. And these
Yeah.
were behaviors that were, closer to something that we could measure, observe, right? Because
Yeah.
all of us, when we think about impact, we actually have something in our mind's eye about the world as it is today that we want to see changed for tomorrow. And so oftentimes we cover that in a lot of abstract language. And when you're thinking about your impact, you want to get really concrete and say, okay, what is it that we're actually caring about? And so for this organization, we started to look at things like grades instead of test scores, right? We're not actually trying to educate kids. We're not actually here as math tutors or, English tutors or something. We're here to provide after school programming and build their character. But that should be captured in their grades, right? Because grades is much more about are you turning your homework in on time? Are you asking the teacher for help when you need it?
Right.
Are you showing up? All of those kinds of things. And so, it's about moving more and more and more from the abstract into the concrete, for the unobservable, which were oftentimes many organizations are trying to change things that are unobservable about people in particular to things that are observable. Now, once you have that sense of what you're trying to do in the world, those are going to be things that you can start to measure and start to observe and start to track. And now one mistake many organizations make is that they just focus on the end. They just measure their impact. Well, it's really important to measure progress towards that. Because if all you're doing is kind of looking at the end, you're losing any learning along the way about how you get there. And for many programs, if your program cycle or your impact cycle is a year or 5 years, that means you're only learning every year or 5 years. And so you want to be thinking about what are the implementation, the operational, the programmatic things that you can be tracking along the way to help you know, are we making progress towards that goal or not?
Yeah. I have a couple other questions, and I think questions are starting to trickle in, which is great. So please, if you have a question that's more contextual to your setting, we welcome those. And there's, the next question is really the reality is our data set as one organization may often, I would be insufficient to measure impact. And I know in years past, we've talked about how organizations are actually collaborating, whether it is a, shared dashboard or, that data. And I would assume there are some sensitivities on how those data, points are shared. Talk to us a little bit about how you see organizations, like in other areas, like another unrelated example is I know organizations work together to pool their resources to often negotiate better deals, right? Things of that nature. And part of the reason the business case they make is they become a much larger group, and therefore it might be an Office Depot or whoever may supply them at better pricing. So when you think about organizations working together, one, I suppose they have to be open to it. What have you seen work in that space of groups actually sharing data appropriately, keeping in mind that all of the privacy issues, how does that work?
Yeah, it's a great question, because in the social sector in particular, if you look at nonprofits, it's a very fractured environment. We
Yeah.
don't have a single provider that has massive market share, right? You don't have one after school program across the entire United States, let alone across your community. And so we have dozens and dozens and dozens of these things. And so finding a ways to collaborate is actually really important, both in achieving the mission, and it enables us to use data in many more nuanced and interesting kinds of ways, right? The example I like to give is if Google was different in every community, Google wouldn't exist. It has the insights that it has because it has such a wide view of everything. So I think collaboration and data sharing is really important. This was actually something we saw a lot of when I was at the Center for Data Science and Public Policy. And then from there, me and a couple other folks founded the Impact Lab. We were doing dozens and dozens of data science projects with organizations around the world. And they all began with trying to get more data from other people, right? That was the beginning part of almost every project.
Yeah.
And then this is particularly true to your point around impact, which is, let's say I'm a workforce development organization and I'm serving people, trying to get them employability skills. Now, I might not know what their actual later employment and earnings is. I might survey them and things like that, but there's a lot of evidence that survey responses and things like that back, especially 3 years, 5 years after they've been served by my program, are going to be really hard to get. But if
For
I
sure.
could go, to somebody like the tax authority and say like, hey, could you tell me how much is Johnny and Sally making, or are they employed or not? It would be really helpful for me understanding my impact.
Mm.
And so that's actually why we started the company BrightHive. We started BrightHive because we'd run into this collaboration and sharing problem again and again and again and again. And it's not a problem that just the social sector has. This is a problem that every organization has around figuring out ways where it's like, I want to share information with you, but I don't like fully trust you. So I'm not just going to give you my data, and you're not just going to give me your data. And so we created these things called data trusts, which are trusts just like any other trust, right? And a trust, you have some sort of asset that's set aside for a particular purpose, and it has a governance structure around it. Well, data trusts are simply trusts for digital assets, for data assets. And so what we see is we're able to create these collaborations between organizations that might have a really hard time sharing information with each other otherwise. And to be able to do it because there's a governance structure wrapped around it, there's auditing, and there's accountability that's wrapped around it. And that can be really successful. And we're seeing that a lot in workforce development is an area where BrightHive has done a lot of data governance work, connecting state authorities and education providers and training providers. Are seeing this a lot right now with COVID, right? Like the contact tracing is a really important topic right now, as many of us are hearing and reading, and figuring out what are we going to do with that data and how will that data be governed, right? Because data around contacts with like who I'm in contact with and where I am at a given point is extremely valuable information. It could be used to market things to me. It could be used to track me. It could be used to figure out my political affiliations. It could be used to figure out my religious affiliations. It could be used against me in any number of ways. And so figuring out how we're going to govern that kind of information is hugely important. And I think part of the emerging conversation right now. But there's plenty of ways for organizations to share data in responsible ways. And I think governance is kind of at the cornerstone of that.
Yeah. Do you find in those scenarios that it's helpful to have a third party independent type of person helping to manage that? Or do you find in most cases, one organization kind of takes lead? Like, how's that approach usually?
Yeah, so I think sometimes practically it can be helpful to have some third party help you set these things up. But with data trust, essentially what we're trying to do is say, let's actually take out the middleman, right? There's a lot of middlemen in the data infrastructure world that bring together lots of data from different people. And I mean, this is true of like financial services and consumer data and all of this. What we're trying to say is, what if all of the data generators just got together and were given a kind of governance infrastructure that they could then self-manage and self-organize, self-monitor? And it becomes like a service instead of like a whole intermediary organization. Like that's, I think, where the future is at, where we all own to some extent our own data and figure out how we give access to it and who we give permission to it to use when and how, and having much greater insight into that transaction.
I sure hope it heads that way. We have some good questions coming in. The first one is, how do you deal with direct correlation of which results you can attribute to your existence actions and which may be coincidental? So like when you look at data, like how much of it, like, how do you discern whether or not it was just coincidental or if there's a direct correlation to your work?
Great question. And so one, I think what this person's really asking is, how do I know when I caused something to happen? How do I know when it just happened alongside what I did? And then how do I know it was because of me versus not because of me, right? And those are all different like levels of statistical proof. So as a statistician, there's like literally different kind of ways of proving causal relationships or not. And that's a really high burden for many organizations to do, because it oftentimes experimental designs and like giving some people your programs and not giving other people your programs that want them and all kinds of stuff. And it can get quite messy. And so oftentimes the first way I'll answer this question is, I actually think it's most helpful and valuable to set aside some of the needing to prove causation, and instead, can I get evidence that something's working, right? Like, I have a friend who always uses this example, right? If I'm going to pay for tutoring services or after school services for my kid, and I'm going to go look up on Yelp and figure out, the best math tutor programs in my community, and I'm going to pay them to teach my kid math. Well, as long as my kid's math scores go up, do I really care if it was because of this program or not? Because like the burden of proof that we put in that kind of transaction is much lower than if I'm a donor and I'm going to say, look, prove to me that this math tutor is exactly the reason that like my kid got better at math. Now, that's because that's actually a really hard thing to prove. In many of our day-to-day transactions, all we kind of care about is the correlation. We care about like, I hired this tutor and my kid's math scores went up. Like that seems to be like good enough for me. And I think we want to bring some of that thinking into how we use evidence in the social sector. And so I think that's really important. So, but to answer the question more formally, there's different kinds of statistical methods that you would use to look at causal proof. And basically what you're looking at is you want, two groups of people that look exactly the same, one that receives your services, one that doesn't, and you're going to look at the differences between those two groups, right? Like it's the closest that we can get to kind of creating the two worlds that are exactly the same in every way possible, except one got your program and one didn't. That's going to help you look at the causal relationship. But I think in most of my work, I'm just trying to help organizations think through, how do you get robust evidence that something's working, and how do you use that evidence to improve? And it's a much lower kind of barrier because it's a much lower, like I'm focused mostly on continuous learning and continuous improvement rather than like studies that prove that something worked or not. And those are important, and we should definitely do those, and there's many organizations that do them quite well. But
it's kind of interesting. I think it's a similar line of questioning right now. One person asks, data is a necessary level, but I think a lot about causal models. Andrew, can you speak to the quote from Judea Pearl, Book of Y? We cannot answer questions about interventions with passively collected data, no matter how big the data set or how deep the neural network. How can data inform an organization's hypothesis about the causal mechanisms that generate the observed data? This goes beyond using data to look good or support existing programs or interventions.
Okay, so there's a lot there. And I'm going to try and to make some sense of this, right? And it's a great question, and whoever asked that, you can email me later and we can get it. But all right, so there's a few things there. So one is this idea of like the role of theory in the interpretation of data. And there's many people that would say that you have to, without theory, without something, like the scientific method is based upon saying I have a question, I have a hypothesis that I'm trying to prove or not prove, right? And so, or I'm going to use data and then it's going to prove it or not prove my hypothesis. And the role of theory, I think, is actually being brought into question by some of the data science methods that are using things like neural networks and looking like in lots and lots of pieces of data and finding correlations and all of that. And so, I think that's an interesting question. I would look into Senthil Mullainathan's work. He's actually now at University of Chicago. He was at Harvard, but he's now at University of Chicago. He's been doing a lot of really interesting stuff at the intersection of social science and data science, which this kind of question is getting at. But I think the thing I would take away from most people here is that we have to be careful about how we look at the interpretation of information without context. And I think theory and context to me, and oftentimes can be helpful neighbors of one another. Like to just simply look at correlations is not going to necessarily give you any insightful information. So for example, there's a strong correlation between ice cream sales and murders, right? Because both spike in the summer, right? Like there's a very, that correlation exists. Right. There's a correlation actually between the number of Microsoft, what's their web program? Whatever their web browser, Internet Explorer. There's a correlation between Internet Explorer usage and murders, because murders have also dropped over time.
I knew it.
Right? So like you kill less people, the less you use Microsoft Internet Explorer, the less you're likely to kill someone, is basically what you can interpret.
Yeah.
So like you have to have context and theory to I think do appropriate data analysis. There's so much more packed in that question though, that I wanted to do on some more, but I'd love to talk with whoever that was.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for that question. I think we have a couple of questions from maybe groups that are smaller, a small nonprofit. Is any suggestions on cost-effective ways to collect data? And are there any type of online tools where a small nonprofit could start thinking in terms of like, not only how do I learn more about this, but are there some ways that we could do this well, basically?
Yeah. So a couple thoughts for small organizations. One is don't necessarily do this alone. Again, like this is where the partnership thing I think becomes, and the collaboration thing becomes very important. For many, many organizations, I won't say for all, but for many organizations, if you're a small organization doing something, there's probably other small organizations doing something, if not the exact same, very, very similar to what you're doing and have very similar needs to you.
Yeah.
So can you find a way to band together and do this kind of data work more collaboratively? Because one of the nice things about data is that whether a data scientist or data analyst is looking at 7 million rows of data or 7 rows of data, it doesn't really cost them anymore. It's the same amount of time, the same amount of energy, roughly, right? So it's not like something that like as the amount of data grows linearly, the costs grow linearly. That's just not true. And so like by banding together, you're able to do this more effectively. So for example, even when I was at the YMCA, a fairly large organization in Chicago, I went to 5 other of the largest out-of-school time providers and said, look, we all go to the same vendor to do the same kind of analysis of the effectiveness of our programs. What if we collaborated and went and did like one contract with them? And it was a little bit more expensive, but it basically cut the cost for each of us by 75%.
Right.
And so like it's like doing this collaboratively is one, start there. Second, think in terms of evidence more than in terms of data, right? So create something like, there's a group called Project Evident. I've been doing a lot of work with them lately. They're fantastic. And they work to create things like strategic evidence plans. And they have lots of resources on how to do that. And we'll actually be releasing some really exciting resources at Salesforce over the next kind of 6 months or so around how organizations can create theories of change and strategic evidence plans and things like that. Like getting your thinking in order, getting your program tightened, and like thinking through like what are we actually trying to accomplish and how, and all of those kind of questions are actually really important preceding questions to actually what data you need to collect. And once you have this kind of strategic evidence plans and theories of change and things like that complete, then you want to think through like what data will actually help prove or disprove the various parts of my theory of change. Right? Will I know how many people are coming? Like that could be an important question that you might want to answer. Or how, how likely are they to recommend my program to somebody else? I don't know what program you kind of have, but like there's any kinds of numbers of questions you might want to answer.
Yeah.
Now, you want to then think through like what's the technology that I'm going to use to collect that information. And there's lots of freely accessible technologies available right now. At Salesforce, every nonprofit organization gets 10 free licenses of our core platform. And it can be like somewhat challenging for some organizations to use, but it's been tremendously helpful for tens of thousands of organizations that they just purely use the free licenses that we give and don't engage with us in any other kind of paid way. And so there's resources like Salesforce, there's resources like survey tools that you can use that are quite inexpensive. And then as you get more complex, you can actually get more and more sophisticated tools and things of that nature. You don't need to invest a lot of money in expensive technologies to do this well. Like this is, I think for many organizations, the place where they want to begin is their organizational culture. Do you have a culture that values evidence and decision-making? Do you want data when you're making decisions? And until you create a culture that wants that, even if you have the most expensive and best tools or smartest analysts in the world, you're not going to use them, and it's not going to actually create the impact in your organization. So start with your culture, start collaborating, and start simple.
We actually have another interesting question is, I think this comes from more in the context of a faith community. And that is like, when you have an institution like that is used to meeting in person. And I think some organizations have experienced this as well. And now because of things like COVID, they've shifted to a virtual environment. In those cases, are you like shifting criteria or what you're measuring as far as what's impact, or does the channel through which those connections are made, like in a community in that type of context, like how do you think about that to show evidence that say they're meeting their mission and such?
Yeah. I mean, we're all having to adapt to this kind of new COVID world, and it's going to lead to different kinds of outcomes and different kinds of impacts, right? So I'll use Good Tech Fest as an example. Good Tech Fest is a conference that I've run for the last couple of years, bringing together social sector data and technology folks. I ran it as an in-person conference that cost like $700 to $800 a person, and we would get maybe like 250, 300, 400 people at our events over the last couple of years. This year, I was like, all right, we can't meet in person. I want to take advantage of this opportunity.
Yeah.
And so we've dramatically lowered the cost. We basically made it free for anyone who registered the last couple of weeks, and it was $100 for other folks. And that's how we ended up with 1,500 people in 42 different countries, right? So now their experience, my breadth expanded a lot. My
Mhm.
depth probably decreased, right?
Yeah.
Because people weren't, having the hallway conversations they might
Right.
otherwise been having, or the networking kind of, and we tried to do some things to help facilitate that, but like the depth might have changed. Now that's, I think, thinking about in terms of breadth and depth, those are kind of two helpful things when you're thinking about your impact. Some organizations have a very broad but shallow impact, and some work with 10 people that go like extremely deep with each of
Mm.
them. Now, and I think this is going to be true for a lot of, like, as you were saying, faith-based communities and things like that. This
Yeah.
is shifting
Yeah.
the way that you engage. And so you have to also maybe shift your expectations of what your impact might be or what it might look like. The other kind of thing to think about this is that there is a correlation between the dosage of an intervention and the impact of an intervention. What I mean by that is and I should say the measurable impact of an intervention. It's really hard to measure impact. And so typically you have to have like a pretty blunt kind of dosage to kind of create that level of change that is observable. The way I like to think about this is if somebody showed up at your program once for 30 minutes, you're probably not going to change their life as much as the person who showed up every day for a week,
Yeah.
for every day, a week for a year, for 3 hours, right? And you have,
Yeah.
150 hours of or 1,000 hours of kind of time with that person. Now, so like that, thinking through those two things is going to be important as we change. And you have to kind of align the dosage and the breadth and the depth to the impact that you're trying to create.
Yeah. I want to go as we wait for, if those who are listening in live right now, if you have more questions, please send them Andrew's way. As we wait for more questions, I'm going to go back to my list because I'm selfishly wanting to ask several other questions. Is when you think about all the latest news around privacy and whether it's social channels and such, one, I'd love to kind of get your thinking on privacy around data as a whole. And really, is there such a thing? And then as organizations trying to have some level of integrity behind the data we're collecting from people, what are some things that we should think about as it relates to privacy?
Yeah, so I think data is a unique asset, a unique thing in our experience. Like I have a friend, Lucy Bernholtz, out at Stanford, who talks about it like water, right? Like H2O can be ice, and it's like really, I could hand you with my hand. It could be water. I could pour it, into your cup. But data is more like steam, in that it's like hard to contain, hard to kind of capture.
That's
and
a
it's
good
one
analogy.
of these things that we use that can be infinitely reproduced but not degraded. Almost every other thing that in our lives, like if I were to give either it's like a good that can't be infinitely reproduced, like if I were to give you my hat, I would no longer have my hat, right? Like you would have my hat. Or if I were to make copies of something, they would slowly degrade over time. Now, data is something that doesn't degrade over time and can be infinitely reproduced. And so this makes that unlike kind of any other asset that we have or any other thing that we have in our lives. And so this is why we have to treat it differently. And so I think data ownership is actually even like a funny kind of thing. Like I don't know how one owns their data.
Right.
I do think that things like controlling access to my information and how it's used and being able to govern my information, that becomes really interesting and really important. And so I think where I think we are is when it comes to privacy in particular, is that we didn't realize necessarily the extent to which we gave up our privacy to get access to free services, right? Like, when you're not paying for the service, when you're not paying for the product, you are the product, right? Is the kind of the tagline that everyone uses, right? And I think in the early kind of digital revolution, online revolution, we kind of gave up a lot of privacy without realizing it necessarily. Now, I think we're kind of trying to pull some of that back, right?
Sure.
And I think, unfortunately, though, that privacy then becomes a luxury good. It becomes something that you're paying for. So, for example, I'm an iPhone user, and iPhones are better at privacy than Android phones. And the thing is, though, Android phones are much cheaper, and it's what most of the developing world is using, right?
Right.
If you go to Nairobi, you're going to see a lot of people walking around with Android phones, right? If you're going to remote parts of Southeast Asia, Cambodia, you're going to see more Android phones than you are iPhones. And therefore, like, they're trading some level of privacy for access to that technology.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be unfortunate that I think for at least the foreseeable future, privacy is going to be a luxury good of the rich.
Mm.
It's not going to be something that's kind of equally available to everyone
Got it.
as a right. And I think but we're still, that conversation's still evolving, it's still happening. And I think it's unfortunate that for the vast majority of the time, our policymakers just aren't like literate in this space. And so policy and law is pretty far behind the technology. And we need to figure out ways, I think, to correct for that and figure out how we as a global society want to handle this. Because the other challenge is that data can move around across borders really easily. But we have all of these kind of like national borders that say, if you're working in emerging countries, like in Africa, a lot of the times they say any data collected in their country has to remain physically in their country. And like, what does that mean? Like, how do you do
Wow.
that? What does that look like? It
Yeah.
is quite challenging. So I think we need more like international cooperation around what data governance and data privacy looks like.
Talk to us a little bit about the responsibility of organizations. To what extent, realistically, um, should our organizations be responsible for security? And how does security, like, what are some ways to think about security around the data we're collecting?
Yeah, I think security is a really important question, especially for those in the social sector, because
Yeah.
we are often working with very vulnerable populations.
Right.
And one of the, I think, the values that I think we have is to not use, where data shouldn't increase the vulnerability of the people that you're working with in irresponsible ways. And so security is a really important
Mm.
question for many organizations. And I think, unfortunately, and we're starting to see this, like, it's not, we hear about when Target gets hacked or these big brands and all of this. It's not that like our big charities haven't been hacked or our small charities haven't been hacked. It's just that we don't even know. Like, we don't even have people that are like watching the door to see if somebody came in. And I
Right.
think that's a problem, right? Because we have very personal information. Now, for individual organizations, from an actionable perspective, you should always kind of think through doing like almost like a threat analysis of your data. What would somebody with malicious intent use your data for? I often think about this,
That's good.
not to get too political here, but like a lot of people of my generation, and the technologists of my age, came about during the Obama administration. I think we kind of assumed like everything's good, like we don't have to worry about like all these authorities, and we'll create all these cool civic apps, and we'll collect all of this data, and we'll do all these really good things, like data for good, way to go. And then, like, I remember being at my first conference right after Trump was elected, even before the inauguration. And I was talking to a group of school districts, and they were saying, we should probably delete all of the data we have on undocumented students, because
Mm.
like
Yeah.
we've been collecting this information to provide better services to them, but now that information might actually be used against them in
Yeah.
ways that they don't realize. And so you have to think through, like, if there was a malicious actor on the other side, like, how might they use your information, right? If you're working in a country where homosexuality is illegal and you're providing services to the LGBTQ community,
Mm-hmm.
like, you shouldn't have like an email newsletter. Like, you shouldn't keep track of their addresses, right? So like, think through those things. And then you got to think through, what's the best way to protect that information?
Right.
I would say like there's a whole host of resources around data security and how you might look at that. But be thoughtful. Like, think through, like, if somebody wanted to do something malicious with this, how would they get access to my information? How would they get access to our organization? And try and create protections there. And this is an area where I think the philanthropic community needs to come together on behalf of the nonprofit community. Like,
Right.
this could be a shared service across nonprofits, helping provide better data security. We just have to find people that are willing to help pay for it and fund it, quite frankly.
Yeah. No, that's good. Well, let me ask you this one last question, because knowing what I know about you and all the various organizations and startups you've been a part of, from consulting firms to nonprofits and such, what was it that attracted you to Salesforce? And since you have such a big title that includes global impact, what do you hope to accomplish with the organization?
So what attracted me to Salesforce is that no other organization has committed as many resources to treating nonprofits professionally when it comes to
Mhm.
technology as Salesforce. Like at Salesforce, we aren't a philanthropy. At salesforce.org, we're a social enterprise. We are a business. We need to be financially successful, but we are because we treat nonprofits with respect as professionals that need the best data and technology to move their work forward. And so I came to Salesforce because I saw this opportunity to work at a scale that is quite exciting. We have
Yeah.
55,000 plus organizations that use Salesforce to move their missions forward. And I think there's also still a huge opportunity for Salesforce to grow into providing better solutions and training and capacity building and support for organizations to use this, not just to do fundraising and volunteer management, for which we have great solutions, but to actually use this for program management and impact measurement and to help build better data infrastructure. And so there's a huge opportunity. And my goal with my role at Salesforce is that I want every organization to know the impact that they're having. Like going back to the slides at the beginning, like what I said, like every organization has an impact. The question is, what's yours? I want to make sure that every organization can answer that question. Whether you're a company, whether you're a nonprofit, whether you're a foundation, whether you're a school, you should be able to say, like, and to not just know what your impact is, but to manage to it and to improve it and to have the technology at your fingertips that enable you to do that.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Andrew. I really appreciate the fact that you are in many ways disarming a lot of the sometimes excuses that can be made where there are these lofty promises of what we're doing. And there's lots of great organizations that I think want to do this and need some help and resources to kind of move in this direction. And I think several have commented here that, this is definitely an area that they need to focus on. And I think this is such a emerging, ever moving, growing space. But I love the way that you framed it, that data is really evidence for our impact. And I think if we can get better at this, are there any tools and resources? Obviously, they can connect with you. And for those who are listening, and you'll see we'll see this recording again online in the next coming weeks. But are there any final words on maybe encouragement or challenge for those who say, you know what, we need to do this better?
Yeah, I mean, I would say every organization can use evidence to do better work in the world,
Yeah.
right? Like evidence scales, right? No matter how small you are, you can be rigorous in your thinking. You can be rigorous in your work. Now, rigor at a very small organization will look very different than rigor at a
Absolutely.
massive, multi-million, $100 million plus organization. But be rigorous in your work and recognize like you exist to create change in the world. There is something about the world as it exists today that you want to see different for tomorrow. Become obsessed with understanding how well you're doing that, and become as rigorous as possible. And start small. Start with your culture, and start in simple ways.
Mm. Well, Andrew, thanks so much for your time and keep doing what you're doing. And thanks everyone for tuning in to this webinar. We hope that it was helpful, and please be on the lookout of this recording in the weeks to come. Thanks so much.